Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my long-term review of the Tamron SP 85mm F1.8 DI VC USD. I'm doing the review today on a Canon EF mount. It is also available on a Nikon F or even a Sony A mount. You don't hear that all that often these days. This lens continues to have somewhat of a unique standing in that it is one of the very few 85mm lenses that has VC, or vibration compensation. You could call it OS or IS, an image stabilizer built into the lens. For that reason, I think it continues to have relevance for some users in particular, as while a lot of the newer camera bodies are coming with an in-body image stabilization, there are still a lot of them out there, including, to this point, we understand that the Canon EOS R5 and R6 are coming soon and are supposed to have in-body image stabilization. To this point, however, none of the Canon mirrorless bodies, and of course, certainly none of the DSLR bodies, have a built-in image stabilizer. So that continues to have a usefulness for this particular lens. But how does it hold up in the modern marketplace after being on the market now for about 4 years? Well, we'll dive into that and explore it as a part of this review. And also to give you my kind of comments on how it's worked for me over that period of time and whether or not I think it's still a valid option for you today. So first of all, let's take a look at the build and the design of this lens. This is a beautifully made lens, and we'll explore why that is. Let's take a look. So first of all, I do want to point out that this is a lens that's seen a fair bit of use for years, and it has held up just fine. The finish looks like it's still in very good condition, and the only thing that I would complain about is that there are a little bit of marks that have showed up on the lens hood, a little bit more of a matted kind of flocked type exterior tends to do a little bit better than a smooth finish, and so that's maybe one of the compromises to kind of a sleek look. This finish of the barrel does pick up fingerprints a little bit, but not too bad, and as you can see, the lens still looks really great after years of use here. So one of the things that stands out about this lens is the fact that it has a very high grade of build. I'm not aware of too many 85mm lenses that are actually made nicer than this. It's an aluminum metal frame to it. There is good weather sealing thick gasket at the rear. There is flooring coating on the front element, and as you can see, front element still looks great there after years of use. And there are internal seals, around the ring and then also at the switches. And where this lens continues to stand out as being unique is, of course, by having an image stabilizer built in. And I think that in many ways, that's where it continues to have relevance in the current age, even as more lenses or more cameras, I should say, are moving towards having in-body image stabilization. Plenty of them, including this EOS R, does not have in-body image stabilization. And so having a lens like this for video work or for some kind of sensitive work where having stabilization is handy, that certainly does make a difference. The focus ring continues to be very nice on this. It's nice and wide, ribbed and rubberized, and a decent amount of focus throw. Not a ton here, but the feel isn't too bad on it either. And 2 switches for the VC, and then an AF/MF switch, 67mm front filter thread, all kind of standard fare here for these lenses. Now, in terms of the size and the weight, it weighs in at a fairly hefty 700 grams, and that is because there is a lot of glass in there. Even with the maximum aperture of f1.8. It's a maximum aperture of f1.8, but light transmission is fairly good compared to a lot of lenses, and so this is a lens that really does compete in many ways with f1.4 lenses. 700 grams or 1.54 pounds, a little over 1.5 pounds, and that's partly from high-grade construction as well. The overall dimensions are 84.8, or right at 85 millimeters in diameter, and then it is 91.3 millimeters in length. That's 3.34 inches by 3.59 inches. And to give you just a little bit of perspective from a lens that is just recently announced that I reviewed not long ago for Canon RF mount, and this is the Samyang 85mm f1.4. What we can see here is that there are a fair number of similarities of design The Samyang, of course, is wider in diameter still to accommodate a larger f1.4 aperture and 77mm filter thread. That's probably the primary difference there in terms of their overall length. Very, very similar. The Tamron's actually the heavier of the two, a little bit higher grade of construction than the Samyang, which really does prioritize being lightweight even for a f1.4 lens. And so, like I said, I mean, I think the Tamron has got, in some ways, the most competitive pro grade. It's held up well, the stabilization is good, and so overall, we have a really nice physical design. One other thing worth noting is that this lens is compatible with Tamron's tap-in console. So if you're on a DSLR, it's very useful for being able to customize autofocus to make sure you're getting the best performance. It also, of course, is useful for being able to do firmware updates at home. We're actually on to revision 4 on the firmware updates for this lens, and so Tamron has continued to support the lens over the years with firmware updates that are helping you to get a little bit better performance. You can also control some of the aspects in terms of like the vibration compensation. You can customize the behavior of that to either have kind of a standard in between or to prioritize the viewfinder. That's particularly useful for video, where the stabilizer comes on smoother, it stays on longer, or you can have a more dynamic viewpoint where you're really only stabilizing at capture. That's the mode 3. But you can program all of that through the tap-in by connecting it to the console program on your computer. One other area where the Tamron continues to be the standout, though it's not really a strength for 85mm lenses in general, is when it comes to minimum focus distance, which is 80 centimeters or 2.62 feet, but a higher magnification level than most at 0.14 times. I believe this Samyang comes in at 0.11 or 0.12 times, and so definitely an advantage for this. The Tamron maybe runs just a little bit longer in terms of focal length. It might be closer to 86 millimeters or so, but it ends up producing a higher level of magnification. So another aspect where it has some value. There are 9 rounded aperture blades. And so as we can see, it does a pretty good job of retaining a circular shape of bokeh highlights when it is stopped down. So overall, I continue to be impressed in the build and the design of this lens. It's held up well, it's sturdy, it's reliable, and it's a very nicely made lens. So as you can see, it's not a lightweight lens. It's kind of in that medium class of weight, and that's largely because of a very robust construction. It's lightweight when compared to a behemoth like the Sigma 85mm f1.4 Art Series lenses, but compared to some other alternatives, including the Samyang that I just showed you, it is definitely heavier than that lens. At the same time, however, there is something reassuring about the heft here. It really feels like a solid, very well-made lens, and as we can see, it's held up, and that's really what I can uniquely tell you about lenses in a long-term review that I just can't do after having had a new lens for 2 or 3 weeks and giving you a typical review at the introduction of such a lens. So kudos to them on that. Now, this lens does have Tamron's USD focus motor, and this was the first of their lenses to where there was a couple of chipsets built into the focus system to allow you to have a little bit more torque in the process. They did that understanding, my main criticism of, say, the SP Prime of the 45mm f1.8 VC lens is it was a little bit on the slow side when it came to focus speed. Obviously, Tamron couldn't afford to do that with a critical lens like an 85mm, so they did increase the torque output and fortunately managed to also give a better than typical autofocus consistency performance with this. I've compared this lens over the years because I've owned it for a number of years. It's ended up in a lot of my 85mm comparisons, as many of you know that have followed. So one of the things that I've determined is that it has continued to have better focus accuracy for me on DSLRs than other third-party 85mm lenses from Sigma and the like. And so I do give them credit for that. Moving to mirrorless, as I've now done exclusively, a lot of those autofocus issues tend to be solved by the difference in the mirrorless focus system. And so, obviously if I'm using it on a Canon EOS R, focus is wonderful. I mean, no problems there. It adapts very nicely. And so if you're considering it for a body like an EOS R, I still think it's a valid option there. And of course, getting the benefit of something like IAF, pupil detect AF, is very, very beneficial from a portrait perspective. Autofocus speed is sufficient for most action. I've used it a lot for portraits, some for weddings. I have used it for events and some action shots. It's not, I don't think that any of these 85mm lenses are a true sport type lens. They're good, but not that good. And so that's not necessarily what I would recommend buying a lens like this for, but I would say for any of your general purpose, including some action, autofocus works just fine. And as you can see from some of these portrait shots, it's been a great companion for taking portraits over the years. Now let's talk about the image quality, which continues to be one of the most important considerations. One of the things I detailed in my initial review, which you can see here, is that a lot of people, when they see f1.8, they tended to associate f1.8 with kind of this bifurcated approach that a lot of the lens makers had, where their f1.8 version of at a focal length, like for example Canon's 85mm f1.8, it was in a really different class from their 85mm f1.2 and then later 85mm f1.4 LIS lens. So the byproduct of that is a lot of people tended to think of an f1.8 lens as being a lower grade lens, not as good of image quality, not as good of build, etc. That really wasn't true with Tamron's approach, because they kind of took a middle of the road approach where they elected to go with the smaller maximum aperture and pair it with an image stabilizer, and that helped to keep the lens size moderate. Also allowed them to really focus on optimizing performance at f1.8. And so at f1.8 and f2, this is an extremely strong lens. It really does compete quite well with some of the very best lenses that I've shown. And I've compared it over the years to everything from the Art Series lens to the 85mm f1.4 LIS to even the Zeiss Otis 85mm f1.4. And I have to say that in many ways it is held up very, very well at equivalent apertures and really gives up very little to those lenses. So I found, for example, when comparing to the Art Series lens, that the Art Series I felt was a little bit better a lens when it came to like studio type work. Had a little bit more nuance in rendering, highlights, and just little variances in face and little grades of lighting there. But I found like the Tamron was a better general purpose lens when it came to the image quality, and there were a number of metrics where the situations where the Sigma wasn't as good. For example, while it doesn't chart showing a lot of chromatic aberration in a lot of lighting conditions, it did have some fringing that the Tamron did not. So some aspects like that. It had, just some better performance aspects of it. The bokeh was really, really quite nice from the lens. So let's take a look at how the actual resolution holds out as we take a look at some chart tests, and then we'll just look at some photos together. All right, so we'll start off by taking a look at distortion and vignette. And so obviously this lens has been out for a little while, so no problem in terms of profiles, all of that stuff. So you can see what we do have is a significant amount of vignette wide open, basically zero distortion. Distortion is a non-factor, but vignette certainly is. And so whether that is an advantage or a disadvantage will really be dependent on the situation. However, it's not so extreme that there's any issues with correcting it, no noise addition or whatever. And so not really a significant problem. Stopping down to f2.8 does clear up a good percentage of that. However, you can see that in the corners, there is some lingering vignette there. Now, on my various tests over time, one thing that stood out to me is that the chromatic aberration control on this lens is particularly good. And while that's become more commonplace now, at the time that this lens was released in 2016, that was actually quite unusual. And for example, the Canon 85mm f1.8 has a lot of chromatic aberrations. Here is a particularly challenging situation, a lot of extremely bright light going into a glass surface. By the way, this is a photo that I love. I've got a large canvas of it on my wall. You may have probably seen it in one of my videos. So anyway, but you can see in this, it has handled this really difficult situation exceptionally well. And so chromatic aberrations are basically a non-factor with this lens. So how about resolution? Well, at a 2:1 pixel level, we can see that there is good resolution and contrast in the center of the frame. As we move towards mid-frame, also quite good, and then down into the corner. This was one of the first 85mm lenses that remained strong right into the corner, and you can see that this is a strong performance here. Now, stopping down just 1/3 stop to f2 does give us a little bit of a boost in contrast, as you can see. And I have quite frequently stopped down to f2 when I want that extra little bit of punch. Gives you a very similar look to images, not a whole lot of loss of depth of field, but you can see there's just that extra degree of punch that comes as a part of that little bit of stop down. So it's worth doing if that's a priority to you. So stopping on down to f2.8 gives us even more contrast and detail. You can see that the mid-frame result is getting crisper yet. And right down into the corners are looking really fantastic. This has always been a strength for this lens. It performs well across the frame. Very, very consistent optical performance. Now, if we go from f2.8 to f5.6, there is a very, very mild continued improvement, but you've gotten the vast majority of your punch by f2.8, and it just gets a little bit better from there. If we compare maximum aperture f1.8 to minimum aperture of f16, we can see at least on the 30 megapixel EOS R that diffraction has not damaged the image too much. It still looks quite good at f16. You're going to see with higher resolution bodies, you're going to see a little more effects of diffraction, but really not too bad a performance here. So you can put this lens on very high resolution bodies like the 5D SR, 50 megapixels, as I did here. And you can see that even at wide apertures, there's lots of detail. It's handling that higher resolution with aplomb there and delivering very detailed images. This image is about f2.8, and you can see that we've got a beautiful amount of detail there on the 5DSR. Lots of skin detail, very, very nice colors, a very nice performer there for a studio shot. This is f3.5. This is actually a portrait I did of my parents at one point. And so you can see once again, 5DSR, lots of detail, lots of skin information. And so it can handle high resolution bodies without an issue. This is 5D Mark IV and a self-portrait here, and you can see here that there's just tremendous amount of detail for portrait work, you know, skin details everywhere. You're never going to have a resolution problem with this lens. Now here's an image that's actually been processed, and so colors are not necessarily natural here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of a landscape image or two, what this lens is capable of. And so you can see great detail across the frame here. That corner-to-corner performance, of course, is really nice for an image like this. And 85 millimeters is actually quite a compelling landscape aperture in a lot of situations. And I really found this lens, I took a lot of landscape images that I really loved with it. Now, the quality of the bokeh is actually very nice on this lens. I always found that it produced a very creamy bokeh rendering on it that belied, you know, the f1.8 aperture. It just delivered results that really had, you know, a shallow depth of field, of course, you know, when you're working at closer focus distances, but a nice handling. Like there's lots of dead branches behind here, and really they haven't created a, you know, a negative situation. I also thought that this particular image was really great. You know, I like to shoot this type of image. It is very demanding though, because of the bright specular highlights there. And so what you can see here is that there certainly is some of the cat eye type look, but what we can also see is that the bokeh circles are really smooth, and you know, particularly where they're nice and round, they are particularly good. Now, one area where this isn't as good as, say, like the Sigma 85mm f1.8 art is that you have to stop down to f2.8 or smaller to get circular shapes all across the frame. And so you're starting to lose the effect a little bit after that. The Sigma by f2, you can get circular highlights across the frame. So that's one area where the Sigma is the winner. But I love this image myself. I think that it's handled this challenging situation really well. Finally, I wanted to just show you one last landscape image. And so I'm going to tell you why this is important in just a second. So this is shot on the 5D Mark IV, and so you can see across the frame really, really nice detail. Look at even into the distance. All the fine details are rendered quite nice. I actually shot this image while testing the 5D Mark IV when it debuted, so it's been a few years. But the reason why this image stands out to me is that it's shot at 1/30th of a second handheld. So clearly this is not the kind of image you could get with another 85mm lens outside of basically the Canon 85 LIS lens that also has image stabilization. And so, you know, that is one unique strength that this lens continues to have. Not only that it can produce highly detailed images, but in this situation, it could do it at a very low shutter speed. So as you can see, really a fairly strong performance there, and it continues to hold up well. I don't think that image quality should really be a differentiating factor for choosing this lens, I think, you know, or not choosing it. I think the image quality is good enough for basically anyone under any circumstance, and I've shot it on even very high resolution bodies like the for example, the Canon 5D SR, 50 megapixels, and it resolved beautifully on there, and so lots of performance for that. So who should consider buying this lens? And I'll show you some photos while I give you kind of my final monologue here. But I would say the person that should really consider this lens, number one, is someone that feels like they could use an image stabilizer for either video or their stills work, depending on what their unique needs are. Some people have shakier hands than others, for example, and an image stabilizer makes a big difference. And so I think that person should strongly consider this lens. Another person I think that should consider this lens is someone that uses 85mm for a variety of purposes, not just for direct studio type work. And if you value portability and packability in a lens, this lens still has a lot of value because it will condense down into a nicely small footprint. It's very easy to bring along. It doesn't have the kind of demands that a lens like, you know, for example, the Sigma 85mm f1.4 Art does in terms of space. And so I think that it really competes strongly in that aspect. Another area where it is certainly very competitive is when it comes to price. And so some people have looked at it compared to, say, the Canon 85mm f1.8 and said, well, it's expensive. It's actually more a competitor with Canon's higher end lenses, and it actually compared fairly favorably to the 85mm f1.4 LIS, for example, when I did that comparison. And so, you know, then you're talking about a price point that is, you know, if not half, it's somewhere, you know, in the 50% less range. And so it offers a strong value, and it's not unusual to get this lens for around $700 US, where it's a professional grade build. It has great autofocus system, has great image quality performance. And so I still think it has a relatively good performance to price ratio. And so that's another reason to consider it. And so there are, as a general purpose lens, it has been one of my favorite 85mm lenses. It does everything quite well. I think that the Sigma and lenses like that are maybe a little bit better of a studio lens, but I've taken a lot of gorgeous portraits with this lens, and I've really loved it for event type work and, you know, kind of general purpose 85mm work, you know, family shots, things like that. It has continued to show its worth over the years. And so at the end of the day, I still think it is worthy of consideration, even though the market has gotten more competitive since its release. I'm Dustin Abbott. I hope that this has helped to give you just framing the long-term, you know, reliability and viability of a lens like this. I'll throw a linkage to my original text review, and also I've generated a fresh image gallery so you can look at kind of the long-term photos that I've taken with the lens and maybe get some inspiration from that. There are buying links also in the description down below, and beyond that, linkage to follow me on social media, become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.